You're crossing the Atlantic at 35,000 feet. Somewhere over the dark middle of the ocean, the steady drone on the left side of the cabin drops away. Not gradually, it just stops. You feel a slight sideways nudge, like the fuselage flinched. Then the nose dips, barely, and the aircraft settles into a slow descent. Most people assume what follows is a steep dive. The pilots fighting the controls, the plane pulling hard toward the dead engine, the cabin tilting into something that feels like the beginning of a crash. That assumption is wrong in almost every detail. The plane doesn't dive. The pilots aren't wrestling anything. And to keep the aircraft flying in a perfectly straight line on one engine, they have to do something that sounds like the opposite of stable flight. They fly the plane slightly crooked. The intuitive picture is straightforward. A plane has two engines. One quits. Now it's running at 50%, half the thrust, half the capability. A serious problem, but a proportional one. That model feels right because it's how everything else works. A car running on 4 cylinders instead of 8 makes roughly half the power. Losing 50% of your propulsion should cost you 50% of your performance. Bad, but survivable. In an airplane, it doesn't work that way, not even close. When a twin-engine jet loses one engine at cruising altitude, it doesn't lose 50% of its ability to climb or hold altitude. It loses roughly 80%. Half the engines, but less than a quarter of the climb performance it had seconds earlier. And the reason has almost nothing to do with the missing thrust. Here's what happens in the first 2 seconds. The left engine stops producing thrust, but it doesn't simply go quiet, it becomes a wall of drag. Air is still ramming into the intake at 500 miles per hour, slamming against fan blades that are no longer spinning under power. That windmilling resistance turns the dead engine into an aerodynamic anchor bolted to the left wing. Meanwhile, the right engine keeps pushing forward with tens of thousands of pounds of force. And these engines aren't mounted on the center line of the aircraft. They're hung far out on the wings, 40 to 50 feet from the fuselage. So the aircraft doesn't just slow down. It feels a massive twisting force, a torque that wrenches the nose violently toward the dead side. Left unchecked for even a few seconds, that yaw couples with a roll, and the aircraft starts rolling toward the dead engine. The immediate fix is the rudder. Deflect it hard, push the tail sideways, hold the nose straight. And that works. The yaw stops. The wings stabilize, the aircraft is pointed forward again. But the rudder fix introduces a new problem. And that problem is what destroys the performance. With the rudder shoved to one side and the wings held perfectly level, the aircraft looks like it's flying straight. The nose is pointed down the flight path. An observer on the ground would see a normal airplane. But the forces acting on the airframe don't balance cleanly. The rudder pushes one direction, the asymmetric thrust pulls another, and the combination creates a net sideways force that shoves the entire fuselage slightly off its own flight path. The fuselage, a tube roughly 20 feet in diameter, is now dragging through the atmosphere at 500 miles per hour at a slight angle to the wind. Engineers call it side slip, and the drag it produces is enormous. That's the answer to the 80% number. The dead engine costs 50% of the thrust. The rudder deflection required to keep the nose straight eats nearly everything that remains. The surviving engine is running at full power, but almost all of its output is being consumed fighting the drag created by its own correction. There's barely enough energy left over to hold altitude, let alone climb. The surviving engine isn't underpowered. It's being bled dry by the aerodynamics of flying straight on asymmetric thrust. The side slip explains the performance collapse. What it doesn't explain is how pilots actually solve it, and the solution sounds like the last thing you'd want to do with a crippled airplane. Instead of keeping the wings level, the pilot banks the aircraft 2 to 3 degrees toward the working engine. A slight, barely perceptible tilt. That small bank does something precise. It takes a thin horizontal slice of the wing's total lift and aims it sideways, directly against the asymmetric thrust. That horizontal lift component assists the rudder, which means the rudder doesn't need to deflect as far. Less deflection means less drag. And the fuselage, instead of plowing through the air at an angle, aligns perfectly with the relative wind. The side slip vanishes. The aircraft is now in what engineers call zero side slip. The fuselage is cutting cleanly through the air. The nose points straight ahead, and the wings are tilted 2 to 3 degrees off the horizon. The plane that looks slightly crooked is the one flying perfectly straight. Getting there is another matter entirely. On an older aircraft, achieving and holding this configuration means physically pressing the rudder pedal with up to 150 pounds of force, roughly the weight of an adult human, sustained through one leg. That's not just a description of the effort, it's a federal certification cap. Exceed it by a single pound and the aircraft doesn't fly until the manufacturer redesigns the tail or adds hydraulic assistance. The threshold isn't aerodynamic, it's physiological, a guarantee that any pilot, regardless of size or fatigue, can hold the aircraft straight through the worst moment of the flight. On a modern fly-by-wire jet, none of that happens. The Boeing 777 carries a system called thrust asymmetry compensation. TAC doesn't wait for the aircraft to start yawing. It doesn't sense the turn after it's begun. It monitors the engine sensors directly, pressure ratios, rotor speeds, fuel flow, and calculates the thrust each engine is producing in real time. The instant that differential exceeds roughly 6,000 pounds, about 10% of total output, equivalent to the entire thrust of a small corporate jet suddenly applied to one wing, TAC commands the rudder to deflect. It physically drives the pedals in the cockpit to match, so the pilot can feel exactly what the computer has done. This happens before the physics of the yaw even reach the fuselage. Pilots in simulator training sometimes don't realize the engine has failed until they see the warning messages on their displays. The physical sensation from the cabin, the one you would feel, amounts to a single bump of moderate turbulence, then nothing. The crisis of asymmetric thrust is resolved before the pilot's hands leave the armrest. With the asymmetry managed and the side slip eliminated, the aircraft begins what's called a drift down, a controlled descent at roughly 100 to 300 feet per minute, about the speed of a slow freight elevator. Over 20 to 30 minutes, the plane settles from 35,000 feet to somewhere between 20 and 25,000 feet, where denser air lets the surviving engine hold level flight indefinitely. 100 feet per minute doesn't sound like an emergency descent. It isn't one. The aircraft is trading altitude it no longer needs for air thick enough that one engine can do the work of two. Meanwhile, the failed engine takes its generator and hydraulic pumps offline with it, and the aircraft's remaining systems reconfigure automatically, rerouting power, starting the tail-mounted APU, without the crew lifting a finger. So the aircraft handles a dead engine almost automatically. The question that took decades to resolve was whether it should be trusted to over open water hours from the nearest runway. If you want these in your feed, subscribing takes 1 second. For decades, twin-engine jets were kept far from the middle of any ocean. In 1953, the FAA established what became known as the 60-minute rule. No twin-engine aircraft could fly a route that took it more than 60 minutes from a suitable diversion airport. The reasoning was simple. Piston engines were unreliable. Oil leaks, fires, catastrophic mechanical seizures happened routinely. If an engine was likely to quit mid-flight, the airplane needed to be near a runway when it did. The rule made twin-engine jets useless for any long-haul route. Crossing the Atlantic or the Pacific required 3 or 4 engines, a 747, a DC-10, and L-1011. Then high-bypass turbofan engines arrived. Fewer moving parts, continuous combustion instead of reciprocating pistons. By the early 1980s, Boeing had data showing the 767's engines averaged 1 in-flight shutdown every 20,000 hours, about 2.5 years of continuous, non-stop operation per engine. The 60-minute rule was built for engines that failed monthly. These failed once in a career. Boeing's engineering director, Dick Taylor, pushed the FAA to extend the limit. The FAA administrator at the time reportedly said it would be a cold day in hell before he let twins fly long-haul over-water routes. The engineering data won. In February 1985, TWA flew a 767 from Boston to Paris, the first twin-engine revenue crossing of the Atlantic. The regulatory framework that made it legal, Extended Range Twin-Engine Operational Performance Standards, or ETOPS, has expanded ever since. Today, the Airbus A350 holds an ETOPS 370 certification, 370 minutes on a single engine, 6 hours and 10 minutes, roughly the distance from New York to Los Angeles, covered entirely on one working power plant. 6 hours on one engine sounds like an extraordinary amount of trust. It is, and the reliability thresholds have climbed far beyond what the 767 first demonstrated. To maintain that certification today, a fleet's engines must sustain an in-flight shutdown rate below 0.02 per thousand hours, one unplanned shutdown for every 50,000 hours of flight. Airlines even prohibit the same mechanic from performing identical maintenance on both engines during the same shift, eliminating the chance that a single human error compromises both power plants over the Pacific. A rule written for engines that failed every few hundred hours was made obsolete by engines that run for 50,000. Everything described so far assumes a clean shutdown. The engine stops producing thrust but stays physically intact on the wing. The drag is predictable. The computers know what to expect. The math holds. On April 17, 2018, Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 experienced the other kind. At 32,000 feet, a titanium fan blade in the left engine snapped from metal fatigue and punched through the engine casing. At 500 miles per hour, the slipstream ripped the shattered cowling apart, turning the nacelle into a jagged wall of torn metal. The predictable drag of a smoothly windmilling fan was replaced by massive, chaotic aerodynamic resistance that no automation was calibrated for. The aircraft rolled 41 degrees to the left in 11 seconds. Commercial flights rarely bank past 25 in normal operations. Shrapnel from the disintegrating engine struck the fuselage and shattered a passenger window, causing explosive decompression. The gentle drift down was no longer an option. The crew dove from 32,000 feet to 10,000, where the air is breathable, in roughly 8 minutes, and landed in Philadelphia 17 minutes after the blade failed. Flight 1380 is the edge case that sharpens the rule. A contained engine failure, the kind the airframe, the software, and the regulations are designed around, is a managed, almost mundane event. Passengers may not realize it has happened until the captain makes an announcement. An uncontained failure, where engine components breach the casing and damage the surrounding airframe, is a genuine emergency that overrides every standard procedure. The aircraft is certified to survive both, but only one of them feels routine from the cabin. Next time you're in a window seat, look at the engine hanging off the wing. That turbofan is designed to push the aircraft forward for tens of thousands of hours. But the entire structure around it, the geometry of the tail, the authority built into the rudder, the logic running inside the flight computers, exists for the moment it stops. The sound drops on one side of the cabin. The nose dips. The horizon tilts 2 degrees, maybe 3. You'd struggle to tell the difference between what you're feeling and the start of a routine descent for landing. That's not something going wrong. That's the aircraft doing exactly what half a century of aerodynamic engineering and certification built it to do. What's something on an airplane you've always noticed but never understood? Drop it in the comments.